Good morning again. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote lecture by Rip Davis. I think many of us here knows him and his work. And nevertheless, my task is to introduce him as a playwright, oral historian, author, director, and community art worker. This is taken from his website. Author over 60 scripts, including many for the BBC, and not just to mention the play Safe. Editor of a number of books, Life on the Fifth Continent. And since the 1970s, trainer in oral history on behalf of the British Library and Oral History Society. For this topic today, I think it's a must to mention that he has chaired the Environment and Climate Change Special Interest Group of the Oral History Society. And if you enter the RIP's bio in our application, the very first sentence says that he is passionate about the climate change. So that's a reason why the theme of his talk is Oral History and Climate Change Testimonies of Weirding. Rip, the floor is yours.
Okay, first I'd like to give thanks for being invited here. So that's through the IOHA and Jakub and the Polish Oral History Association, and also the university. Okay, I'm going to be talking about the relationship between oral history and climate change, and also about oral histories of climate change. And I hope you'll forgive me if I have to talk a bit about climate change itself. Are we having a problem? Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay. The term climate change implies moving from this to that. But actually, that's not what's happening. We know a fair bit about the this, how we've been living. The that is very unclear. It's something unexpected that we're moving into, something unpredictable, certainly something not normal. In fact, what we're moving into is weirdness, is strangeness. The title of this talk actually comes from a phrase I heard years ago, which is about not climate warming, but climate weirding, the weirding of the planet. So testimonies of weirding. The sources for this presentation are not my own interviews. They come from people I've met through running the online seminars, which I'd like to talk about later if we get the chance. Others I've met through them, and some excellent books around the subject, which we'll be citing as we go along. I'd like to give particular thanks to those interviewers, researchers, and interviewees, and some of the researchers and interviewers are actually here, which makes me more than a little nervous. And particularly I'd like to thank Sean Holman, Jessica Taylor, and my friends at the British Library in preparing for this talk. Now, in the early 1980s, I was working on writing and directing a series of documentary plays, and at that time, working with coal miners in the Midlands of England. So it was the 1980s. They were telling me about working in the 1920s and the 1930s. So they were telling me about their experiences underground, about working with ponies underground, about some of the terrible accidents that happened there. They were telling me about their own personal lived experiences. Not once did it occur to me, these people are working in the fossil fuel industry. Should I be asking them a bit about that? Didn't occur to me. Didn't occur to them to say anything about it either, let alone talk about the impact of what they were doing upon the climate. And I was a bit late to coming to this. It wasn't until 2005 that I went to a talk by Paul Allen from the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales. And he opened my eyes to what was going on. At that time, I was working part-time in a museum and gallery, and I started doing some exhibitions and events around environmental issues. And I started to think about what we were taking for granted as normal. Is there anything, in fact, normal about our consumption levels, our expectations of travel, our expectations of using materials, our use of power. These all seem normal to us. I think future generations might look back and think, no, there's nothing normal about that at all. We were being incredibly extravagant. One might even say irresponsible. So when Bruno Latour talks about an ecological class, he's talking about the need for a new mass understanding of what should be considered normal. About 5 years ago, I started to think, well, I'm an oral historian and a playwright, so what can I actually do in this? So I wrote some scripts, a couple of climate change comedies. And yeah, I know, climate change comedies. So those did not fly. And then I saw that the Environment and Climate Change Special Interest Group of the Oral History Society was moribund. So I got myself made chair. There wasn't a great deal of competition for this role. I mean, who wants any of these posts? And after some consultation, we decided what we wanted to do. We wanted to put together a world map of who was working, doing what on oral history of climate change, and we wanted online seminars. So that's what we've been doing, and as I said, I'll be very happy to talk about those later. And I've drawn on the contacts from those for this talk. Now, I'm not covering all aspects of this issue. It's absolutely impossible in the time available. And I'm not even able to cover all geographical regions. So I hope I've covered my back, but you can never be sure. I'm also not dealing with the environment. I mean, I am dealing with the environment. Of course, climate change and the environment are inextricably bound up. But I'm focusing particularly on climate change. So, testimonies of weirding. Hold on. Come on. Hello. There we go. Betty Jackson. She was
on the days that I was off. So on the days
I'm wanting to get to the slide before, and it's just not doing it. Okay. Right. Betty Jackson. She was interviewed for the Rising from the Ashes Chimney Tops 2 oral history project. Now, wildfires are a regular occurrence in parts of North America, but they don't happen in Tennessee. Except now they do.
So on the days that I was off, we would always take our dog to the Gatlinburg Trail, because that's one of the places you can walk your dog on that trail. You know, I realized as the days got closer to the actual fire, it was like we even felt like we had to cover our faces when we would walk the trail because the smoke, it was so bad. But it kind of became routine because it just seemed like the smoke was going on for weeks before, you know, the actual event. We met a tourist on the trail, and he said, "My goodness, is it always this way?" And we were like, "It's kind of been the normal lately, so, you know."
It's kind of been the normal lately, so, you know. So she was aware that what was happening was strange, and yet at the same time, she's also starting to normalize it. And this is a pattern through many of the interviews that I've listened to. The normalization of the weird. Thousands of miles away, Katie Holmes conducted interviews in the Victorian Mallee. That's in the northwest of the state of Victoria in Australia, for the National Library of Australia and La Trobe University. So this next extract is less about normalization, although it is also about that, and more about anxiety, uncertainty. And then climate change, invidiously and insidiously, and almost without our knowing, then suddenly that was it. And we knew that there was something that had happened and was happening and would continue to happen and get worse. And how did you know? Well, because the rains became even more uncertain. We had a prolonged period of drought. Things died. We felt even less sure that things were going to be all right in the long run. Conversations were more about Are we going to be all right? Are we not going to be all right? What's going to happen this year? So this climate change-induced weirding is producing a sense of uncertainty, that you can no longer rely on what you relied on in the past. Now, just in case you need reminding of what's been going on, in 2025, global temperatures have increased by 1.4 to 1.6 degrees since pre-industrial level. Sea levels are now rising 3.2 millimeters per year. Since 1970, North Atlantic hurricanes, the major ones, have increased by 60%. The likelihood of storms undergoing rapid intensification has increased fivefold since 1980. Since 1979, polar ice has decreased by an area larger than the size of Spain. An area of land experiencing extreme drought has nearly tripled since the 1980s. Extreme wildfires have become more than doubled in the last 20 years. The insurance company Allianz states there's been a 181% rise in reported flood events since 1980. 80% of fish species are shifting towards the poles, some by over 600 miles. We're now in the fourth global bleaching event, impacting approximately 84% of the world's coral reefs. A 2020 study found that climate change contributed to the local extinction of 47% of 960 animals and plant species surveyed, and disasters triggered 26.4 million internal displacements of movement in 2023. It's hard to keep up. Do you feel a bit overwhelmed? Well, if so, here's some more. Data. Now, I had thought that data doesn't really have much of an effect on us, but it does. It does have an effect. The problem is, pretty much it terrifies us. It alienates us. The data can actually distance us from the events while at the same time terrifying us. We want to go and hide under the sofa, or perhaps join Elon Musk on his planet B, Mars. What's needed is to connect in more complex ways to human beings, to their lives, their voices, their narratives. This doesn't alienate us. This involves us. Now, the issues of climate change have been known for a long time. The danger of global warming is as yet unseen, but real enough for us to make changes and sacrifices so that we do not live at the expense of future generations. Margaret Thatcher in 1989. She changed her tune fairly quickly. Joseph Fourier actually came up with the theory of the greenhouse effect in 1824. So there's no lack of knowledge. The biggest problems around this are the power of the fossil fuel industry, the increasing politicization of the topic, and reluctance of governments and populations to accept what is happening and make the necessary changes to way of life. Now, in this politicized arena, are we in danger of being accused of campaigning, of losing our attempted neutrality as historians? Yes, I know, we can't be neutral, but we could at least try if we felt like it. Well, what have we actually been focusing on as oral historians for many decades? Individuals and communities who tend to have been left out of the historical record. There's an ideology behind this, even if we don't call it campaigning. We're trying to broaden and change perspectives on history and on the present. We're trying to draw attention to different value systems. Surely, subtly or not, we've been campaigning for a long time already. Meanwhile, climate change doubters often run rings around climate experts in broadcast interviews. Climate scientists, with some notable exceptions, are not always the best communicators because they talk and they think in data. We're all historians. We know about the importance of emotions, but I think this is particularly important in this field as opposed to data focus. In training sessions, when I have the time, which is not often, but when I do, I ask people, what are the most important things in your life? The answers are different, but they overlap a fair bit. People generally talk about their close family, their close friends. Some lucky people talk a bit about their work. Some sad people talk about their football team. So what are the most important things in your life? These are them. And then I ask, and why? And you very quickly get to emotions, love in particular. Now, it seems to me that histories that leave out emotions are a bit odd, since emotions lie behind what is most important to us. And personal stories are emotional, and oral history is personal story. We connect, I think, mainly through the emotions that are transmitted. The Climate Stories Project does interviews of its own, but it also collects self-recorded testimonies from around the world. In Malawi, there's been increased frequency of drought, floods, and strong winds. Here, Chisomo Chawanga in Malawi talks. This was last year.
My name is Chisomo Chawanga. I am from Malawi. Malawi has experienced numerous floods and droughts in the past 5 years. One experience of drought that I have is waking up at 10 p.m. to go and fetch water at the one borehole that was supplying water to hundreds of households because all the other boreholes had dried out in my home village. The Society of Malawi pinpoints that it is solemnly the law of the women to make sure that the household has water supply. I still remember how scared I was walking in the dark from my home to the borehole, scared that something might happen to me because this was the life-threatening experience. I also remember when I was young, how I used to love the cold weather. After the rainfall, the smell of the fresh, wet soil infiltrating my nostrils. But today, all I get after the rainfall is unpleasant heat. I remember the fun time I had playing with butterflies that could follow me when I made a lookalike of the butterfly using a plain paper, a string, and a lobe. But due to climate change, these butterflies have extinct. This saddens me, for my children will never have the fun childhood that I had. And now, I live and work in a community consisting of hard-working farmers. I've lived in so many districts across Malawi, but I've never seen anything like this before. During the rain season, they intercrop 3 different crops, namely maize, tomato, and cowpeas. But because of the drought and dry spell, crops are drying in the fields to the extent that people have started irrigating their crops using water from the borehole. This angers me and at the same time inspires me to take action against climate change. And that's why I became a climate change activist affiliated with 3 NGOs that work towards combating climate change impacts. I plant trees as a way of mitigating climate change impacts in my community.
Okay, the emotions are very clear in that. She talks about her sadness that the butterflies are now extinct. She talks about the pleasure of that smell in her nostrils. She talks about her anger over the misuse of the boreholes. She then goes on to talk about her personal action in response to this. Other oral histories, as in this next extract, focus on the authorities' response, but again in very human terms. So Soledad Gatsambide lives in Puerto Rico, and she talks here, this is in about 2019, following Hurricane Maria. Or at least she should.
It felt a little extreme, right? It went from, this is worry to, okay, we're cutting off your water 2 times a week and you only have water one day. So it doesn't, you'd think that the in-between is don't wash your car or don't do this, but when they finally take measures, they're basically shutting off your water during a certain time. That's what happened in this last drought.
So they shut it off. It's not like a voluntary.
Oh,
let's
no.
they- Oh.
The rationing, basically, people would be without water for a couple of days, and then they'd have water a couple of days, and then they'd put the water back on, like that, for months.
I am so sorry that I'm looking this shocked. I'm sorry.
I thought you knew that already.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it was,
That's severe.
and it didn't touch me that bad. That's why I was telling you that I felt guilty. Because it didn't touch me that bad, my rationing wasn't that bad, but I kept hearing of all my coworkers and all other people who were like, oh, we hadn't had water for, and I'll tell you straight up, it's worse to not have water than to not have electricity. Electricity, you can kind of do this and that. I mean, of course, we live in a tropical island where there's no winter. I guess that would make a difference, but water's the worst.
So climate change and the authorities' response to it is having a direct impact on people, how people are living. It also has an impact on how people make a living. So Joe Scavone of New York, this is driving me slightly nuts. Joe Scavone spends his life catching clams. These are small shellfish. Of New York. Storm Sandy came along, and for a start, it changed the colour of the water. And then after that, the fish started arriving at strange times of year. Joe goes on to talk about how first storms and then extreme cold had their effect.
Superstorm Sandy, when she came through the bay, it had to be, I think people were saying it was 8 feet above normal or 9 feet above normal tides, that just washed all the clams off the sandbars. So that did damage to the sandbars. Then that was that storm, but then the following winter with all the cold weather, everything in the bottom froze and died. And right now, still, up till 2 days ago, I'm still digging in areas where you see all these clams that are still together like that, with nothing inside. You'll get patches of them, like say in a 10 by 10 area. There'll be, 50, 60 clams that are still under the bottom that froze and they're dead.
So a combination of first a hurricane, and then extreme cold in the same place. This is weirding. Half a world away, in the Saloum Delta of Senegal, it's delta, so this is very low lying. So obviously it's very prone to coastal erosion and particularly to rising sea levels from climate change. Then you can add high winds. So here we have a documentation, a testimony of a changed way of life. The people there were making a living from collecting shells from the seashore. In 2014, when I returned to the Saloum Delta region, the coconut palms that had lined the sea were on the ground. Houses were flattened. Women in the community had to borrow canoes to search for shells far out in the ocean as they walked to the edge of the shore to fill their basins with products. This is how I truly understood how climate change was ravaging this island area. Now, Indigenous peoples' knowledge for many years has been pretty much ignored, particularly by Western academia, but that has been changing. It actually deepens our knowledge greatly and our understanding of these processes over time. And that's because their experiences are pinned to localness, to a deep knowledge of a very particular place and setting. And also their observations are long-term, which is hugely important. Julie Cruikshank has worked collaboratively with the Yukon First Nations elders, and she comments on oral accounts of people of the Yukon. Hunting peoples carefully study animal and plant life cycles, topography, seasonal changes and mineral resources. Elders speaking about landscape, climate and ecological changes are usually basing their observations on a lifetime of experience. In contrast, because much scientific research in the north is university-based, it is organised around short summer field seasons. The long-term observations included in oral accounts provide important perspectives on the questions scientists are studying. Farrell Sekekuku in North America was for 30 years chairman of the Hopi tribe in Arizona. He talks here about how the daily sky has changed over a long period. He says, I see dark clouds would appear early in the morning from Grand Canyon all the way across to the Apache Trail, IOHA2025 we call it. It used to be dark. If you look out, the horizon used to be like this, and you can see the clouds coming, and it used to be all the way across. And eventually, about 2 o'clock, it would come, it would arrive, and it would be drizzle rain. We don't have that anymore. We don't hardly see it anymore. But we blame it on the corrupted lives that we're living now. So what was important was not the amount of rain, it was the type of rain that had changed. They needed drizzle for their crops, and they were no longer getting it. And he says, but we blame it on the corrupted lives that we are living now. He then goes on to talk about that in a spiritual way. Now, whether you see it in that way or not, I certainly do see what's happening as being about humanity's corruption. Now, this next quote is from part of the Gwich'in climate change database held in Alaska. And this is about the melting permafrost. Now, permafrost melting releases huge quantities of CO2 into the atmosphere, but it also has a direct impact on the people living there. I noticed that the permafrost, the depth of the permafrost has changed a bit over the last 10, 15 years. Because we used to be able to pull a layer of moss off of the ground, cut it and pull it back, and there'd be ice right underneath. And we could use that as a refrigerator for our meat and fish and whatnot in the warmer months. But now, the permafrost is a little bit deeper, so it seems to be slowly melting from the top. Same with along the Mackenzie. There's one slump just below our camp at our old berry place where it's thawing out year after year after year. As soon as a whole layer of silt thaws and flows down to the Mackenzie, it exposes the ground behind it. And at the next year, a whole bunch more trees and vegetation and soil and melts and flows right down. Like the permafrost underneath it melts and it flows right into the Mackenzie. So when I was a kid, this is just a small slide. Now, it's a huge, huge area. It's like maybe half a football field or something. Leslie McCarthy just told me just the other day that the results of this are that the river, a huge river, has actually changed its course. So people who were living next to the river and working on the river now find they no longer live next to the river. Caleb Pungoei, also in Alaska, was raised by his grandmother on the St. Lawrence Island in a traditional subsistence lifestyle. He talks here about how he was told and observed changes in the night sky. My aunt Mabel Tooley, when I interviewed her back in 1966, mentioned that they used to be able to tell the weather through the stars. And, their general observations, be able to predict at least 3 days in advance. What the weather would be like, because the hunting depended on it, travel depended on it, and therefore safety. It was something that they were very conscious about. And then she said, in Unipiaq words, the earth is very fast now. Meaning that, in her observations, that the weather systems are so fast now that you can't, predict the weather anymore. And that they used to be able to tell the weather by looking at the stars and whether they were twinkling or not, how fast they're twinkling. These observations come from a deep involvement with the natural world. However, such a deep involvement has not necessarily meant concern about the environment. Paul Merchant has carried out a review of interviews carried out in the 1960s to the 1980s in the UK with people who were intimately involved with the countryside. And what he found was that many who worked in the countryside were not really aware of worries about the environment, despite the publication of Silent Spring in 1962 and Limits to Growth in 1972. They weren't becoming concerned about it until the mid-1980s. He comments, "The study of wildlife on the one hand and conservation on the other could be remarkably separate." And actually, if you look at the early documentaries of David Attenborough, you see something similar. It took him quite a while to wake up. And then Paul also noticed that not everyone trusts their own observations. So the effect of an expert or the presence of a scientist can lead farmers who have an expertise gathered over decades to feel that somehow their knowledge is insignificant in comparison. In Australia, Deb Anderson carried out a series of interviews about the drought that peaked in 2006 to 7. This was possibly the worst drought in 1,000 years. But what she found was that long-term views were not necessarily helpful. She comments on the celebratory remembrance of past survival, as local communities sought solace in a historicised capacity to endure trying conditions. Celebratory remembrance, so celebrating having survived. Testimonies showing attitudes towards climate change are often tied up with identity. As former Premier of Queensland Anna Bligh told reporters in the aftermath of the 2011 Summer of Disaster, which included Cyclone Yossi, "We are Queenslanders. We're the people they breed tough north of the border. We're the ones they knock down and we get up again." So, as Deb Anderson comments, conceptions of climate are shaped by historical narratives of identity, forming both a cultural legacy and a shield from anxieties about the future. So what was emerging is a survival myth, the making of communal identity. Toughness will get them through these times because they've got them through the times in the past. This also tends to put the climate disaster comfortably back into the category of weather. Katie Holmes, also working in Australia, had similar interviewees. For example, climate changes every year. But then I think you go back through the stories of the 30s, the late 20s, through to the 1950s. They had some pretty dry times those years. There's also the need to think that things will work out in a particular place because people have invested so much in it already. Even here, like, if it is climate change, we've still paid good money for the land. You're committed. You're here. You can't be thinking about going somewhere else. You're in for the long haul, so you really better make the best of it. Also, it seems that many interviewees express the need to believe that science will somehow solve the problem. That, along with their proven adaptability. As Katie Holmes says, oral history throws into stark relief the huge personal and environmental cost of the narrative of infinite adaptability. However, for many, climate change, the climate crisis, the climate emergency does feel like an existential threat, because it is one. So we're in the area of trauma once again. Of course, Mary Marshall-Clark touched on this the other day. Sean Holman and his team in Canada at the Climate Disaster Project have been doing amazing work in this field. Now, from a conversation that he and I had, he outlined the 4 stages that in their project they go through when dealing with climate-induced trauma. So the first of these is to re-establish safety. The second is to retell the story that's being heard. The third is to reconnect with the community, because as Sean pointed out to me, climate trauma disaster separates you from your community. And the fourth is the repairing of harm. The first three stages, he told me, were adapted from Judith Herman. Now, how are these aims being met? Well, Sean feels that the first two aims are more or less being met. And he points out that their work he sees as being therapeutic. Now, I know a number of people over the last few days have been talking about this. I think in general, as oral historians, we divide ourselves off from therapists. So if what we do is therapeutic, that's just a happy byproduct. But Sean sees this as central to what they are doing. Then the third aim, reconnecting with the community. Well, that's being patchily met. The fourth aim, repairing harm, if by that we mean dealing with the causes of these problems, well, no, we've got a long way to go on that. Reconnecting with the community. This can be done through theatre. The theatrical process, most obviously performance, and then cast audience discussions can all help. Eyes of the Beast is a play presented by the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, working with Climate Disaster Project. And here we've got edited extracts of a monologue which itself was taken from an interview with a health worker who was working after a period of extreme heat in what she refers to as BC, that's British Columbia.
We just don't see heat stroke in BC. I've never seen it in my career. I'm sure people have seen really severe heat exhaustion, which is very different from heat stroke. Heat stroke means that the cooling systems in your body have all malfunctioned. You are basically cooking inside out. We ran out of cooling blankets with the volume of people coming in. Our ice machines broke. We were grabbing ice from upstairs units and literally bringing them down in buckets and just slapping them on people. Nothing else would cool them down. It becomes a 20-person endeavor, but there's so many code blues and cardiac arrests. How can you do all that? You can't. What can I do with my ability? With my resources, with my 2 hands, 1 brain, what can I do now? I was crying. I never really cried at work. You couldn't call family to be with them. Hold their hand. You couldn't even acknowledge that they've passed. I would see family members in the hallway and I'm literally running, gunning it across the hall to get to another patient and I can't even talk to them. People were suffering and they died alone, like literally alone.
Sandy Boyd in Scotland. His testimony is one of many young people talking about the effects of the climate crisis upon their mental health. He was interviewed for the oral history of the environmental movement in the UK. As a teenager, from 2019 onwards, he was involved with XR. And for those who don't know, XR is Extinction Rebellion, involved with direct action, things like closing off motorways to draw attention to the climate crisis. And he was also involved with the youth strike movement, which involved taking days off school to demonstrate and get involved in other activities connected to drawing attention to the climate crisis. His testimony is about the traumatic effects of the doom scenario of climate change.
And the other thing about Extinction Rebellion was obviously their narrative, and XR was brilliant at pushing that. Their narrative was so outrageous and so rude and just, it's stuck in our heads, right? But so many young people attest to this. The amount of damage XR's messaging did to our mental health is phenomenal. I don't want to put all the blame on XR at all, but that moment in 2019, there was nobody thinking about these young people's mental health and what it was doing to us to be embracing ideas that, yeah, you can handle when you're 25, but when you're 15, it's like, you know, climate collapse, social collapse, you know, social disorders, is XR's biggest claim, right? Is that like food system collapse will lead to social breakdown, which will lead to killings and all these horrendous things that the horrendous person that Richard Hallam says. And that was being absorbed by us 24/7 as 15-year-olds with all the other existential dread you've got when you're 15. It's like, really fucked us up. So that was starting to come in after March 15th. We were starting to, I was sitting in maths watching XR, just basically like having panic attacks going, why am I in maths? I should be in London getting arrested right now. And, that sort of burnout, like you cannot stop, you've got to keep going, was mental. And I was always driven by looking around my class and going, all my friends, this is sounding really a bit too courageous, but whatever. Like looking at my friends and just going, I don't want them to ever think or feel this. And that drove me for so long, and it still does to a big extent. Whenever I'd see like young kids, like 7 or 8, I was like, this is not your job. The other reason I think I hated XR or had a resentment to XR was it was the older generation, and I felt let down by the older generation. There was so much anger, which I think I unfairly leveled at my parents, my teachers, my mentors, of this. You're telling me to like look after myself, but what are you doing about my future? And that was the message of the Youth Strike movement, right? Like, what are you doing about our future? And yeah, that was a sort of wild emotional roller coaster of, climate, grief, anxiety, loss of like my childhood. I felt like I could no longer enjoy a childhood. I had to sacrifice it. And I still feel that loss. Like, I don't think I had a childhood I was meant to have.
So in interviews, how should we be approaching environmental issues? Heather Goodall, a leading Australian oral historian, says, I usually first ask people to talk about their life story, because in doing so, they inadvertently reveal how their lives have been embedded within environments, as they talk about things, doing things, or being in particular places. Now, the Climate Disaster Project has certain fixed questions that are asked at particular points within an interview, where an interviewee has been through a climate disaster. So the first of these is, how did this make you feel about climate change? This is at the end of asking about their experiences. Then there are a series of health questions, and then questions around solutions. What do you think can be done about climate change that is increasing the frequency and intensity of these kinds of disasters? And then, what do you think can be done to help people like yourself in the future? Now, they are not asking questions like, for example, what can be done to reduce fossil fuel emissions? These interviews are not forcing the interviewees to make the link between fossil fuel emissions and climate change. They are simply asking them about their experiences and what they think should be done. The attitudes that we have towards climate change seem to me to be very much linked to how serious the consequences are or may be for you personally. Jessica Taylor, with whom I've worked with students at Virginia Tech, she points out that they only interview the people who are still there. I mean, they don't interview the people who are not there. In other words, they don't interview the people who've been driven from their homes by climate disaster. So the people that they do interview can afford to have a rather different perspective. Like Sean Holman, Jessica Taylor interviews many people on the right of the political spectrum. That's the sort of area she lives in. She points out that there's a problem with this amongst liberals. She says that many liberal people are not taking rural and generally more conservative people's views and experiences seriously. And she says that's a massive mistake, that their experiences, their understanding of events are just as valid as those of others. But who are most affected? Who are most affected by climate change? We live in a festival of inequality on this planet. And climate change is an injustice that is inflicted very unequally. The oral histories collected by Voice of Witness puts the effects of climate change into a wider context of global injustices more generally. Evelyn Nimmo has been working on oral histories in southern Brazil, observing changes in the cultivation of the important herbal crop erva mate. And she points out that race, class, ethnicity, and geography all intersect with gender to create layered experience of vulnerability and resistance. For example, Indigenous women in rural areas may face different challenges than urban women due to their reliance on land-based resources and traditional knowledge systems. So yes, climate change does not affect all populations equally. geographical location, including latitude, unequal distribution of extreme weather events, particular vulnerability of, for example, coastlines, and then there's the impact magnified by existing social, economic, and cultural inequalities, both globally and locally. Women, particularly in rural and marginalised communities, often face heightened vulnerability to its impacts. For example, as we've seen, women in many parts of the world are primarily responsible for managing water, managing food, managing healthcare. These are responsibilities that are directly dependent on those natural resources that are most threatened by climate change. There have been different traditions of collecting testimony. In India, the collection has been rather different to that in the West. First, it exists in the context against the background of the colonial archive. Brian Williams and Mark Riley, talking in the context of India, remind us oral informants are no more parochial and no less trustworthy than written accounts in a colonial narrative. But oral testimonies rarely contain the same pretensions to universal truth. So who carry out the interviews, how they're carried out, how they are analysed is extremely important. Holmes and Goodall again. Oral history as an intellectual field in the British academic arena emerges from social history. It prioritises the human story. Human experience, memory, and meaning are its central concerns. Nature is a given, something upon which humans act, but which has no inherent agency in itself. In India, interviewing the members of subaltern or marginalised groups has been widely pursued, but although historians have been involved, this rich body of interviewing has been most often undertaken by researchers in anthropology and sociology. In each of these strands of Indian environmental scholarship, there's been more attention to the collective and less to the individual process of memory and retelling. So although extensive interviewing has occurred, it's often transformed into collective and structural analyses. So if we're looking for oral histories of climate change, sometimes we really need to look under different headings. And then, what of climate justice? And by climate justice, I mean fair restitution for those suffering most from the effects of the climate disaster. Well, those who ought to be the recipients of climate justice, it seems to me, are reasonably represented in the testimonies. But attitudes towards climate justice itself seems to me pretty poorly represented. Of course, there's a north-south divide here. The north of the planet has been mainly responsible for the climate disaster. The south of the planet has been very, very unequally affected by it. But Sean Holman just invites us, drawing on his oral histories, to have a rather more nuanced approach. He gave me the example of retired people he knows in Canada. They can no longer afford to live in the cities, they move out into the countryside and then have their home wiped out by wildfire. These are not the people we may first think of when we think about climate justice, but we should be thinking of those too. Clearly, the climate crisis is having catastrophic effects. We're documenting in these oral histories destruction of communal and personal identity. Climate change can drastically affect who we are, who we think of ourselves as being. In 2022, Terry Mustonen carried out interviews with Siberian reindeer herders and fishermen farmers. Usually it was common to have minus 50 degrees Celsius in the wintertime in the past. Sometimes it went down to 60 degrees when I was at school. But now we witness climate warming. It is rare nowadays to have even minus 45 degrees temperatures. Last winter, 2004 to 5, was very warm, with only minus 30, minus 35 at the coldest time. I do not know why it is so. Perhaps it results from the mining activities, industrialization of our region. Warming is real, it is happening. Weather has changed so much, and the old markers to predict weather do not hold true anymore. Language will disappear. I have great fears. We are explaining all that we can to our children, but I am still afraid. I am afraid even to speak about things which are coming. We will try to preserve all that we can. Now, Mustonen last met Kulesov in March 2010. In July 2010, he heard that Kulesov had taken his own life. Strangely, climate disaster can also have a very different effect. In Listening on the Edge, Eleonora Rowland quotes an interviewee Lorna Bro, talking about the effects of Hurricane Katrina. Before Katrina, I felt like a fish out of water in New Orleans. I was very uncomfortable here, always kind of complaining and why can't we leave? And amazingly enough, after Katrina, I felt that there was nowhere else in the world that I would really fit in or belong. Hurricane Katrina made me a part of the fabric of this city that I never was before. You know, we're all woven together now. So shared trauma can in fact produce a huge bonding with a community. And that was sort of what was happening in those examples I gave from Australia earlier, although in a very different way. So there are many different focuses of climate crisis oral histories. There are focuses on particular regions, such as the Arctic, particular disasters, we've just seen Hurricane Katrina, geographical types, coast, rivers, oral histories focusing on activism, such as the oral history of the environmental movement in the UK, international collaborations run by, for example, Columbia University, Newcastle University, Monash University, oral histories of local and community activism, so those around the false changes of land use in Madagascar, for example, Sarah Osterholt's interviews. But behind it all, there seems to be a wish not just to document, but also, yes, to campaign, a call to action. Action to reverse the trend of heating of the planet, and at the same time, action to mitigate the effects that are already with us. And yet, well, here's a quote from Bruno Latour and Nicolas Schultz's memo on the emergence of an ecological class. People's energies used to flow from their ideas. Understanding a situation was enough to mobilize. Today, the certainty of catastrophe seems rather to paralyze action, which is what we're trying to work against. But what sort of action should we be taking? Extinction Rebellion, or XR, is best known for its controversial direct action. So that's what they think needs doing. And yet here, in a recent article in The Guardian, from a leading figure in Extinction Rebellion, Rupert Reed, he writes, "The key lesson we must draw is that we urgently need a mainstream, inclusive climate movement that goes beyond activism and enters everyday life, engaging everyone from businesses and professionals to ordinary citizens. If we're to have a hope of flourishing during the climate breakdown, we need a movement that invites people to share in its determination to act. One of the best ways of achieving this is by channeling our energy into practical solutions for adapting to the climate crisis that's already here." So here we have someone whose solutions seem to be direct action, now calling for a mainstream, inclusive movement. That means all of us. And he talks about adapting to the climate crisis that's already with us. Now, many oral histories are documenting precisely this adaptation, communal attempts to transition to a lower carbon society, and also to transition to a world where we do adapt to the effects of the climate crisis. Latour and Schultz have very little patience with the term transition. The charming euphemism transition underscores as ineptly as possible what is well and truly a violent upending. Okay, but nevertheless, as the oral history of the transition movement has been documenting, the transition movement is becoming a notable player in the response to the climate crisis. The transition movement is a movement of communities, often referred to as transition towns, working towards cutting fossil fuel use, boosting local environments through sustainable initiatives, and strengthening local self-sufficiency. It's very much about localism. As its founder, Rob Hopkins, has stated, if we wait for the governments, it'll be too little, too late. If we act as individuals, it'll be too little. But if we act as communities, it might just be enough just in time. But he recognises that it's a massive task that's faced. Marcus Hall has commented, I don't think environmental historians can or should be disinterested. Which takes us back to close to where we started, the oral history of climate change as a political act. Now, Sean Holman runs the Climate Disaster Project in Canada. I've referred to him earlier. We had a recorded conversation recently talking about this presentation. It wasn't an interview, it was a chat. And we weren't intending for it to be used, but I couldn't resist using parts of this. Like Rupert Reed, he calls for involvement beyond that of activists. And for him, this particularly means the involvement of oral historians.
I mean, I just can't help but think that all the wrong people, right? Not because they were ill-intentioned, right? But because they were ill-equipped, right? All the wrong people were put in charge of, climate activism, right? It was environmentalists and scientists and science journalists and environmental journalists, right? Who are all interested in communicating to very particular audiences. My own view is that I don't think those people in those professional groups, right, were well prepared to communicate on what appears to be a scientific issue and what appears to be an environmental issue, but is not a scientific issue and environmental issue, at least not solely, right? And I think, for the audience you're talking to, right, this is where oral historians, hey, we can do this. We can do this, right? But that's also why I would encourage, right, oral historians who perhaps are not already involved in environmental oral history to be involved, right, in this particular issue. We need those people, right? We need the different perspective, right? Of oral historians, right? Who, are involved in other issues, right? To come into this space and tell different kinds of stories.
So Sean here is calling for the work of oral historians as a form of climate activism. To return to where I started, here are just some examples of what we're currently faced with. In Argentina, President Javier Milei has called climate change a socialist lie. In the United States, the Republican administration has made 30% cuts in staff to the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which incidentally holds an invaluable oral history collection, which I've quoted in this presentation. And they've made billion-dollar cuts to that organization. Where the term climate change is erased, clearly, climate change ceases to exist because it may not be spoken about. Well, we have to speak about it. We have to record people speaking about it. Now, as I've been showing, I hope, a lot of good work is being done, but I still think we need to focus on particular areas. I think we need to include questions on the climate in our life story interviews. I think we need to continue to collect stories of community action and response. I think we need more longitudinal studies. I think we need more from the global south. The pressure for climate justice will only increase with more testimonies of climate change from the global south. And we need to find imaginative ways to better communicate and more widely disseminate stories of the climate through creating videos and films, such as those produced by SECMOL in the Himalayas. by producing interactive exhibitions using oral history, such as that presented by the Favela Climate Memory in Rio de Janeiro, by creating more podcasts using oral history, such as Our Broken Planet, and by using oral history testimonies sensitively in schools, as in the TIDE Global Learning Program, or as here in the Project Jukebox in Alaska, introducing teachers to local climate-related storytellers. We need to be using climate change oral histories more in colleges and universities, as is happening at Newcastle University. And we need to be presenting stories through theatre and other art forms, as in the Arts and Climate Initiative. And we should be working more effectively with international news outlets, such as those harnessed by the Climate Disaster Project in Canadian, British, and German newspapers. So this is a page taken from a British newspaper. Now, the image here is from After the Flood, a drama on independent television, shown here on the website of Climate Spring. In film and television, there are organisations such as Climate Spring and Green Rider, which are getting a recognition of climate change into film and television scripts across the board, whether those are about climate change or not, just because climate change is part of our everyday life. Now, this clearly is about a flood, but as I say, they're getting this into all sorts of dramas. I think we need the equivalent approach. We need to be including climate change questions in many, many more of our interviews. I'm going to finish by posing some questions that I don't have the answer to. So, should we be interviewing climate skeptics? Should we be giving them that platform or not? Should we be doing more interviews with scientists, not just about the science, but about their stories and emotions? How can we make more use of interview collections that already exist in the archives? Looking back through, for example, at the British Library, there are collections held on the water industry, on the oil industry, on the electrical supply industry. Going back into those, they reveal the story of climate change. And how can we use archived, apparently non-related material? People talking about their summer holidays, or how they stayed warm, or their travel, or building design. Can we further then explore ways in which oral histories show what is responsible for climate change, the so-called normal life in the West? And how much should we be thinking about the effects on the environment and the climate of storing all these oral histories? All the power that we're using, that has to come from somewhere, and all the water that we're using. Do we need a greater emphasis on oral history of migration? I know it's happening. Do we need more? And then, do people always react to all of this in the ways that we would like them to? How do we avoid people having reactionary reactions to these stories? You know, oh, blimey, all these people are going to be moving all over the place. Bring the drawbridge up. Finally, I don't see the climate crisis as the topic of some oral history interviews and projects, very important though those are. Rather, I believe the climate crisis should and must infuse the whole of the oral history movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Now we have enough time for a couple of questions and comments. Maybe someone in the audience knows the answer to your questions. If I may suggest, let's collect like three, 4 questions, and then we'll review, so that we'll have just enough time to get at least 1 or 2 rounds of questions. So, yeah, the floor is yours. There is a question over there. Tomasz, 1, 2. Mariusz, can you distribute the mic? Or? Yeah, because of the light, I barely see you, but yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Tomáš Pavlíšek, and thank you for your lecture. I think you succeeded in mobilizing us from becoming paralyzed. And you also mentioned your research with miners, paleontologists, and so on. So I was wondering, what would you recommend me for calibrating the individual testimonies? They express the identity and emotions and so on. But I mean the calibrating because of sorting of the data. What are the local conditions, geographical conditions, geologist conditions, just that we are good then in sorting of those data and spreading them to the particular issues, also for the society and for the promotion. Thanks. I think, what would you recommend how to cooperate with some other skilled professionals from nature scientists?
Just below.
I think he wants to answer that first. I think Rib wants to answer the question first, and then take another. Or should we ask a question?
Well, I have to apologize because I didn't follow your question. I don't hear that well. Could you just put it in a very simple form for my very simple brain, please?
In the chat, your colleague Sharon said that this is not the scientific issue, yeah? But I am asking myself, how should I calibrate the oral history and testimonies to the particular local, global conditions when we are talking, when the people are talking about their experiences?
Okay, Sean did realize that he was overstating and immediately qualified what he said. So he said, this is not a scientific and not an environmental issue, or at least not solely that. So I think he recognizes that we absolutely have to work and should work with scientists and environmentalists. Of course we do. But that we have to do it through human interaction, and we have to do it looking at the local issues. Does that partly answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for this intriguing talk, because I believe climate change is an urgent issue and we are not addressing it enough. I think one of the takeaways from this talk, according to me, would be that excerpt where you said that if we wait for the government, it will be late. If we act as individuals, it will not be enough. But perhaps if we act as communities, we might be able to tackle this issue. Largely owing to the fieldwork that I have done, and I'm still doing that, in Sundarbans, one of the precarious areas in the Gangetic Plain surrounding Bangladesh and India, and the kind of how the water is entering is basically eating up into the lands of the people. I have seen communities coming together to also form certain ideas regarding how to structure their home. So I was wondering if you can talk a bit about resilience from the communities as well.
Sorry, can I interrupt you a second? You're wondering if I can talk about what?
Resilience, how communities come up with strategies and come together to, as a resilient community, to tackle climate change in their own indigenous manners.
Can you just review that question for me?
Basically, I'm asking if you have come across instances where communities frame their own strategies bereft of government support to act as resilient communities to tackle climate change in their own manner.
Okay, I think what you're talking about relates most closely to the transition movement work, which has not been government inspired at all. It's about local communities taking responsibility. But what they have managed to do in many places is affect local provision by local government, not by national governments. So local councils changing their provisions locally, and food supply locally being altered, where you get your food from, and so on. So my feeling is that communities working together is incredibly important. But it also can have an effect cumulatively, I think, on government policy over a period. Again, I'm not entirely sure if that answers your question, but I'm doing my best.
Hello, thank you so much for your inspiring talk. I'm Maria from Lebanon, and we have been dealing with, my question is, how do you deal with climate change and activism protecting the earth in times of conflict? I mean, for example, I'm thinking of southern Lebanon, which has become, not to mention Gaza, but directly impacting the agriculture with phosphorus bombing and uprooting of trees. How do you? Of course, the communities there are very aware, and they are, but their voices aren't heard, even though people are doing work on this thing. So how do you, I guess, galvanize the action for that?
I wish I knew the answer to that, but at least I got the question right. I know about oral histories. I'm not an expert on climate resolution. Listening to the people yesterday, I was thinking about my talk, and I knew I was going to finish up saying I think climate change should infuse the whole of this oral history movement. But I'm sure that people dealing with the immediacy of terrible crisis in terms of conflict, climate change is just not going to be the top of their agenda. They've got other things to think about. So I don't have an answer to that, I'm afraid. I do wish, though, that people would realize the effects on the environment of the investment that is being made in conflict, because it is enormous. But I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to it.
Further questions, please. From here we barely, there's a question here in the front.
Thank you. Rib, I live in South Australia at a very, in a very small community. At the moment we have an algal bloom in the ocean that's killing the fish and some dolphins. Now, as a small community, we all are very much aware of that. As we walk on the beach, we see dead fish everywhere. But we don't know what we can do. We're together as a community. We have no idea how to deal with algal bloom. It's because of the warming of the water. But, it's good to say that we need to come together as a community. But what do we do?
Okay, well, you're an oral historian. So you interview people about that phenomenon. You talk to them about their experience of the sea, talk to them about their experience of fishing, and then you disseminate that material. You get it into the local newspapers, you get it onto the news, you do publications, you do exhibitions, you do events, you use the oral history of that event. And as I say, we're not other things, we're not scientists, but we use our oral history. So that's what I would say you should be doing.
Hi, my name is Fernanda. I'm from Brazil. I think currently we're facing lots of challenges. One of them is also how do we deal with AI usage? And the creation of data centers is one thing that has been worrying a lot of Brazilians in a place already where it's famous for having lots of droughts. And I'm wondering, how should oral historians think of AI usage, which is the new normal in academia, while we're also thinking about interviewing people? So basically what I'm asking is, I know already a lot of people use AI, and I'm wondering, how do we interview people about their issues with environment, and then use AI to maybe process those interviews and help us process those interviews in light of the huge environmental damage that AI usage ends up making?
Yeah, personally, I think the use of AI is hugely worrying for a myriad of reasons. But but particularly because of its impact on the environment and on the climate. In the UK, the government is investing as we speak, as Starmer is ingratiating himself to President Trump, in huge investment in AI centres that are going to be using masses of power and water. And I think we just need to think very hard about our extensive use of AI in oral history as in other parts of our lives.
Hi, Rib. My name's Shirlene Robinson. So we've talked before about the Badger Forest Road Oral History Project in Australia. So thank you for your great presentation. I just have a question about your comment about should we keep interviewing or be interviewing climate change skeptics. And I have some thoughts about that, but I wondered if you would like to expand on your personal thoughts about that issue.
Yeah, I've got mixed feelings about it. I think in the future, people are going to want to look back and see histories of climate change skeptics to understand where they're coming from. I think that's important. But at the moment, I just don't want to be doing it. I don't want to be giving these people that platform. How would you, if you do an interview with a climate change skeptic, they're going to demand that this is given just as much publicity as everything else that you're doing. How do you then present that in a way that is not encouraging other people to take the same line? So I just have very mixed feelings about it.
I'll just say very, very quickly, I guess an interesting example was when the National Library of Australia did a project on HIV and AIDS, and there was a question of whether people should be interviewed who were deniers of HIV leading to AIDS. And the decision was made that some people who had those beliefs should be interviewed, but for every one of those people who were interviewed, that should be counted with at least one scientific or medical expert as well. So I don't know if that really puts a way forward, but it's an interesting question that we grapple with.
Thank you.
Yeah, there is a okay. Yeah, just.
Can you tell us something more about what are you doing in this special interest group inside the Oral History Society? Maybe it could be also inspiring for other national Oral History Association and also for the International Oral History Association.
I was really hoping somebody would ask that. Well, we organise seminars, online seminars, so we have speakers from all around the world, and those have been fairly successful. And the other major thing that we've been doing is putting together this world map. So if you go onto the Oral History Society website, and then you go to special interest groups, and then you go to our one, scroll down to the bottom of that, and you'll find this map. We've got about 90 projects on us at the moment, environment and climate change oral history projects. Now the map is extremely incomplete, and it's very much the Anglo-Saxon world, very much English speaking, and that's probably because I'm English speaking. However, I have written to every oral history society in the world using the list supplied by the IOHA. And from those emails, I received one reply from Ireland. Thank you, Ireland. Which is a bit of a shame. Now, it may well be that those emails just finished up in junk folders, fine. But what I would really like after today is to be flooded by emails from you guys saying, why haven't you got this from Ecuador and from Vietnam and whatever? You give it to me, I'll put it on the map. And I think it's very, very useful for people to see what other people are doing in other parts of the world, to learn from that, be inspired by it. So yeah, those are what we're doing. I think we need to...
Yeah, I think I have a time for one short question, if there is any. Yeah, there is.
I think I disagree with your answer about, you said you didn't know how to make these voices heard. But I think you yourself have given a very good example today, because you are only one person making your lecture, but with all those quotations, it gives the lecturer a terrible power. I think that's a very good example of how to use oral history. And well, my question is, the transition movement webpage, maybe it's an idea to put quotations like this on the website so that we all can use it when we make speeches or lectures in our countries. We can pick from this and show the big engagement all over the world, like you did.
Thank you very much for that, Bjorn. Yeah, I think we're going to have a link on the website, possibly to the filming of this event. So yes, and I'm sure you can use that. So yeah, great.
Thank you, Riv. Thank you all. Before the round of applause, fully desired, short announcement. There is a coffee break. Please begin all the sessions at 11:15. Yeah, and the lunch break is still in between 1 and 2. So if you are a bit late, there will be still some food waiting for you. And now, please join me in thanking for this wonderful lecture.